Video được Việt hóa bởi Ngọc Tân từ group tài nguyên dựng phim. Nghiêm cấm các hành vi lít về rồi bán cho thằng khác. Mọi ý kiến đóng góp xin gửi về Facebook Quỳnh Ngọc Tân.
Let's jump into the color page of Resolve and start messing with some colors for one shot. In our color timeline, I'm going to go about halfway through shot 8, park my playhead at about 2308. And the very first thing that we need to do when we're talking about color correction is look at the shot and decide what might not be right. So at first glance, there's a couple different problems with this shot. The first one is that there's really not enough contrast. Nothing in this shot really is black. It's kind of just darker grays, nothing super bright white. This one's still kind of a light gray, at least on my monitor. The colors aren't really popping. There doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of shape to anything. It's just all kind of gray and flat. So that's definitely not what we want if we want a pleasing image. And so let's take a look at how we might fix something like that with our color palettes down here. I'm going to do a couple things just so we can see it a little better. I'm going to close my gallery so we can see this a little bigger. And I'm going to hide my clips for now because we're just going to work on this clip. So let's close the clips, just give us a little bit more room. The very first thing that I would start playing around with the color page would be the color wheels down here. Now, this looks like some really fancy stuff, but it's actually pretty simple, and there's only a couple different kinds of controls here. They're just kind of duplicated. Let's start really simply with the offset. Each of these kind of controls, there's 4 little sections here, and each section has a color wheel and a master wheel. If we click and drag in the middle of the color wheel, the farther that we drag in a direction, the more color that we're going to push into the image. And the direction that we push is the hue of the color. So this is basically hue and saturation. So hue is the actual color and saturation is the strength of the color. So we could make this all super orange if we wanted to, but let's not. We can reset anything by hitting this little circle arrow, and that's what the color wheel does. The master wheel down here, if we click and drag, if we drag to the right, that brightens things up. If we drag to the left, it darkens things down. And so for our whole image, we can adjust the brightness by moving the master wheel and the hue and saturation with the color wheel. Now, why are there 4 wheels here? Well, offset moves all of the colors in the whole image. The other 3 are lift, gamma, and gain. These do the same thing, but they only mess with certain parts of the image. The darkest parts, midtones, and the lightest parts. So gain messes with the lightest parts. And so there's a difference if we push this over to pink. It still moves a lot of the image, but it moves it a lot stronger where it's brighter. Gamma moves the midtones. And lift moves the darkest parts first. And this happens both with the color wheels and the master wheels. So if we want to do something like make the brighter parts brighter, we can go to the gain, which is the brighter parts, and take our master wheel and push up to the right. And now the brighter parts of the image are brighter. If we want to make the darker parts darker, I can grab the master wheel on the left and push it to the left, and that makes the darker parts darker. And now we have a lot more contrast in our image. We can take a look at what we've done. We can turn on and off our color adjustments by clicking this little bypass color grades button right here. And as we turn that off and on, you can see there's a huge difference. So that's looking a lot nicer. Again, it's always good to go back and just look at your shot and see, what don't I like about this? Well, the contrast is a lot better. The darker parts are dark enough. The brighter parts are a lot brighter, but I still don't feel like the colors are very bright. So one thing that we can do is boost up the saturation for this image. Down here near the color wheels, we have all these little controls kind of around the top and bottom of the palette. And these do various things to the image. But one of them is SAT for saturation. And if I mouse over this number and click and drag to the right, that's going to put more saturation into our image. So if I drag this to the right, I can drag this really far and make the colors really bright and poppy. That's probably a little bit too much. So I'll just take that down somewhere in here maybe. And now not only do we have more saturation, but we have brighter colors. And all that we've learned so far, this is so much of color correction, is just looking at the image, deciding something that you don't really like, and finding the correct tool to fix it, which again, you can fix, I would say 90% of things just with the color wheels, lift, gamma, gain, offset, and these little sliders down here. There are a lot of these little things. Definitely take a look and play around with them. One that I like to use a lot is this temperature slider, and that will change the color temperature, which means basically if it's more towards yellow or orange and more towards kind of bluish. So we can kind of dial in the feeling of our whole shot just by moving the temperature slider back and forth. We also have a contrast slider, which if we click and drag to the right and we push more and more to the right, we'll just add more contrast to our image. You may notice that this does a similar thing to what we did by pushing our gain up and bringing our lift down. That's because a lot of things in not just the primaries wheels, but everything in the color page, there are different ways to do the same thing. And it's totally okay. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what you prefer. Some people don't even touch the lift or gain and they just do it with contrast. Some people never touch the contrast and just use the gain and the lift. No big deal. Once we get something that we like, it's a good idea to kind of save this correction. The easiest way to do that is right-click on the viewer and select Grab Still. What that will do, if we open up our gallery, is save a still image as well as all of the color settings from this shot, and it'll keep it here in the gallery so that we can reuse it on a different shot, or we can reload it if we mess things up here. So let's do this same correction, but a different way. You can reset all of your color by right-clicking here in the node graph and saying reset all grades and nodes, or you can just hit Control Home. And when we reset it, we're back to our ugly gray looking image. So let's take a look at doing this a different way. In this middle palette here, we have our custom curves. Now, if you're familiar with an image editing app like Photoshop or Affinity Photo, GIMP, whatever, you might be used to this kind of curve. Long story short, this lower left-hand side is the black point in the image, and the upper right-hand side is the white point. And if I take this white point and I push it all the way to the top of the graph and kind of slide it to the left, that's going to start to make everything brighter. This is actually the exact same thing as pushing up our master wheel in our gain. And this lower dot, if I push it to the right, that's the same thing as bringing our lift down. And so we'll get a very similar result here just by pushing these two dots. Now, the cool thing about the curves is you can kind of adjust the tone of the image a little bit easier. Things that are middle brightness like gray, you can make those a little brighter or a little darker and keep the darkest and lightest parts kind of where they're at. You can actually do the same thing by boosting up the gamma.
Video được Việt hóa bởi Ngọc Tân từ group tài nguyên dựng phim.
That's about the same thing as making a dot here and pushing it up or down. But you do get a little bit more control with the curves because you can make as many dots as you want. So I can do something like make the middle bright tones a lot brighter than they normally would be, and the middle dark tones darker than they would be. And we get a little bit of a different look, a little bit harsher contrast here. So the custom curves give you a lot of control. But I'll just right click and get rid of these so that we can see the difference. I'll boost up our saturation a little bit. Now we can compare this with our first correction that we made with the gain and the lift by going over to our gallery, right-clicking and saying play still. And now it's a little bit different. I bet we can even adjust these curves to where you barely even notice a difference. And we can get this almost identical by using totally different tools. Pretty awesome. So again, it's really just kind of dependent on what you feel like working with. So generally what I like to do for one shot like this is make it look correct, which I would say we're pretty close right here, and maybe just give it a little bit of a curve here in our custom curves, just to make things pop a little more. So here's before and here's after. Just gives it a little bit more life. So even with this little basic intro to the curves and the wheels. There is so much potential to be able to do like so much stuff in color. Really, really exciting.